The doorbell rang at 9:42 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, and by the time I opened the door, there was no one there. Just rain, and the porch light flickering against the wind, and at my feet, a wicker basket with a folded blanket inside it that was moving. I crouched down before I even understood what I was looking at. A baby. A baby girl, maybe 6 or 7 months old, red-faced from crying, wrapped in a yellow blanket that smelled like baby powder and gasoline. Tucked into the side of the basket was a white envelope, soaked at one corner from the rain, and across the front of it, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were 4 words that would end my marriage before I even read the letter inside. For Daniel Carter. Personal. If you're invested in this story already, stay with me, because what I found in that envelope 10 minutes later was only the beginning of what my husband had been hiding from me for almost a year. My name is Megan Carter. I'm 32 years old, and at the time all of this happened, I worked as a marketing coordinator for a healthcare technology company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My husband, Daniel, is an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown called Hargrove and Lynn. We had been married for 7 years. Together for 9. We owned a modest brick 2-story in a quiet neighborhood near Lake Harriet, the kind of street where neighbors wave from their porches and everyone knows whose dog is whose. From the outside, our life looked exactly like what we had always wanted it to look like. What nobody could see from the outside was the 3 years we had spent trying and failing to have a baby of our own. I am not going to pretend that part of the story doesn't matter, because it matters more than almost anything else in what happened next. 2 rounds of IVF, 2 losses, a drawer full of unused prenatal vitamins, and a folder of insurance denials that I still, for some reason, hadn't thrown away. I had cried in fertility clinic parking lots more times than I could count, and Daniel had been there for some of it, and not there for the rest of it, because somewhere in the middle of our second round, his firm sent him to oversee a 4-month build in Madison, Wisconsin, and he started living there during the week and coming home only on weekends. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things were temporary. I never imagined that temporary would come back to my doorstep in a wicker basket a year later, crying in the rain. Let me back up for a second because I think it matters that you understand what an ordinary Tuesday looked like in my life before any of this happened. That morning, I had made Daniel's coffee before he left for the airport, the same way I did every Tuesday he traveled. 2 sugars, splash of oat milk, lid on tight, because he always drank it in the car. We had texted twice during the day, nothing important, a photo of a sandwich he'd had for lunch, a complaint about a client who kept changing the floor plan. I had come home from work, eaten leftover pad thai standing at the counter because cooking for one felt pointless, and spent the evening half watching a home renovation show while scrolling through baby name lists on my phone, a habit I had never quite managed to break even after 2 failed transfers because some stubborn, foolish part of me refused to stop hoping. That was the version of my life that existed for exactly 1 more hour before the doorbell rang. I want you to hold on to that version for a second, the boring, hopeful, ordinary one, because it is the last time I remember feeling like my life belonged entirely to me. I carried the basket inside before I let myself fall apart. That was instinct, not composure. The baby needed to be warm and dry, whatever else was happening, and so I set the basket on the kitchen island, peeled back the wet blanket, and found a healthy, furious infant in a onesie with a hospital ID bracelet still looped loosely around her ankle. The bracelet had a name on it. Baby girl Holt. Not Carter. Holt. For one stupid, hopeful second, I thought maybe this was some kind of mistake, a wrong address, a prank, anything other than what it actually was. Then I opened the envelope because some part of me already knew I had to. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, and the handwriting got worse as it went on, like whoever wrote it was running out of strength. It began, "Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't find another way, and I am so sorry it has to be like this." My hand started shaking somewhere around the 3rd sentence. The letter was signed Vanessa Holt. I had never heard that name in my life. By the time I finished reading both pages standing at my kitchen island with a stranger's baby asleep 3 feet away from me, I understood 3 things with total, sickening clarity. My husband had a daughter. He had known about her for months, and the woman who gave birth to her was dying. I want to walk you through exactly what that letter said, because every single detail in it would later become evidence, and every single detail in it would later be confirmed true, no matter how badly I wanted it to be a lie. Vanessa wrote that she had met Daniel the previous October when she was working as a site coordinator for the clinic project he was overseeing in Madison. She wrote that what happened between them lasted roughly 2 months, and that she took full responsibility for her part in it, but that Daniel had known she was pregnant since the following March and had given her $40,000 from what she called his account to, in her words, make it go away quietly. She wrote that she hadn't made it go away. She wrote that she had kept the baby, named her Grace, raised her alone in a 1-bedroom apartment outside Madison with no family of her own, because her parents had died when she was in her 20s and she had no siblings. And then she wrote the sentence that I have never been able to fully unhear in my own head since. I found out I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer in July. I have maybe a few weeks left, and there is no one else in this world who is supposed to take care of Grace except her father. I know I am asking you for everything after giving you nothing but a problem. I am asking anyway, because I love her more than I have ever loved anything, and she deserves a chance that I can't give her anymore. There was a small folded piece of paper inside the envelope as well, a printed paternity test result from a lab in Madison, dated 3 months earlier. Daniel Carter. 99.98% probability of paternity. He had known, not suspected, known with documentation for 3 months, and he had said nothing to me. Not one word, while I sat next to him in bed some of those very nights, talking about whether we had the strength left in us to try a 3rd round of IVF. I called him before I even decided to call him. My fingers just did it. He picked up on the 2nd ring, and I could hear restaurant noise behind him, silverware, someone laughing. He was at a work dinner in Chicago, 350 miles away, eating steak while his daughter screamed on our kitchen counter. Hey, what's up, he said, casual, like it was any other Tuesday. There's a baby in our kitchen, I said. My voice came out flatter than I expected. Her name is Grace. Her mother's name is Vanessa Holt. Does any of that mean something to you, Daniel? The restaurant noise didn't stop, but his voice did. There was a long silence, long enough that I genuinely thought the call had dropped, and then he said the 4 words that confirmed every horrible thing I already knew. Megan, I can explain. You can explain. 2 words I would hear so many times over the following weeks that they would eventually lose all meaning, the way any word does when it's used as a shield instead of an apology. He drove home that night instead of staying for the rest of the conference. It took him almost 5 hours in the rain, and I spent every one of those hours sitting on my own kitchen floor next to a baby I didn't ask for and didn't know how to feed, calling our pediatrician's after-hours line for guidance on formula, because whatever else was true, the baby herself hadn't asked for any of this either, and someone in that house had to act like an adult. By the time Daniel walked through the front door at 2 a.m., soaked from running through the rain from the car, I had already fed Grace, changed her with a diaper I'd bought in a frantic midnight run to the Walgreens on Hennepin, and rocked her to sleep in the guest room. I met him in the kitchen with the letter and the paternity results laid out flat on the island, the way you'd lay out evidence for a trial, because that is exactly what it had become. He didn't deny any of it. I want to be fair and say that much. He sat down across from me, put his face in his hands, and told me the whole thing in pieces, the way people do when they've rehearsed the apology, but never the confession. The affair had started during the loneliest stretch of his Madison assignment, the same stretch where I was recovering from our 2nd failed transfer alone in Minneapolis, because his job had him 3 hours away. He said it meant nothing, which is a sentence I have come to believe means almost everything to the person hearing it and almost nothing to the person who said it. He said Vanessa told him in March that she was pregnant. He said he panicked, pulled $40,000 from a home equity line we had opened together for kitchen renovations we never actually did, and gave it to her with the unspoken understanding that she would handle it however she needed to handle it, and that he would never have to think about it again. I thought it was done, he kept saying. I thought she terminated it or moved, or I don't know, Megan, I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. You got a paternity test 3 months ago, I said, sliding the lab printout across the counter toward him. That is not the behavior of a man who didn't want to know. He had no answer for that because there wasn't one. The truth which came out slowly over that first horrible week, was that Vanessa had reached out to him in May after Grace was born, sent him photos, asked for the test because she wanted Grace to have his name on the birth certificate eventually for her own sense of fairness to the child, even if she never asked Daniel for another dollar. He'd taken the test secretly at a lab clinic during a supposed work trip, gotten the results, and then done absolutely nothing with that information except bury it. He never told Vanessa he'd take any role in Grace's life. He never told me she existed. He went home every weekend during those months and sat at our dinner table and talked about baby names for the baby we were still hoping to have, while his actual daughter was 7 hours away in an apartment he had visited exactly twice. I am not going to lie to you and say I handled that first week with Grace, no pun intended. I screamed at him more than once. I threw his phone into the backyard at one point, which I am not proud of, but I also am not going to pretend I regret. What I want you to understand is what happened underneath all of that screaming, which was a baby in my guest room who hadn't done anything wrong, whose mother was somewhere in a Madison hospice bed right now, dying alone, because the man who fathered her could not find the spine to be honest with either one of the women in his life. The next morning, I drove to Madison myself. Daniel offered to come, and I told him no. I needed, for reasons I couldn't fully explain to him at the time, to look at Vanessa's face before I decided what kind of person I was going to be in this story. The hospice facility was on the edge of town, a low brick building with a garden out front that nobody was using because it was October, and everything outside was dying along with the season. A nurse walked me to Vanessa's room after I explained who I was, and I watched the nurse's expression shift from polite confusion to careful, practiced neutrality, the look of someone who has learned not to react visibly to the strange shapes grief takes in other people's families. Vanessa was smaller than I expected, hollowed out the way people get when cancer has been eating them from the inside for months. She was 26. I want to repeat that because I think about it constantly. She was 26 years old, and she was dying, and the last thing she had left to do on this earth was make sure her daughter ended up somewhere safe. "You came," she said, when I sat down in the chair beside her bed. Her voice was paper-thin. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you wouldn't just call the police on me instead." I thought about it. I admitted, because there was no point lying to a dying woman. "Why didn't you call him? Why leave her on a doorstep in the rain like that?" She told me she had tried calling Daniel for 3 days straight before she made the drive. 3 days of unanswered calls, because he had blocked her number the week before. The same week she had told him over text that her hospice doctor said she had less than a month left and she needed him to make a plan for Grace. He hadn't responded to that text. He had blocked her instead. He never told me any of that part. I confirmed it later through her phone records, which her hospice social worker helped me access, because by then I had stopped trusting Daniel's version of any story that involved himself. "I didn't have anyone else," Vanessa said. "My parents are gone. I don't have siblings. I have one friend who's 7 months pregnant herself and can't take on a baby right now. I had maybe 2 weeks left to find Grace somewhere to go, and the only name on her birth certificate that wasn't mine was his." She looked at me with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with her illness and everything to do with the months she'd spent alone with a newborn while sick. "I know what I did to your marriage. I'm not asking you to forgive me for that. I'm asking you to look at my daughter and tell me you'll make sure she's loved, because I won't be here to do it, and he's never once, not one single time, asked to hold her." I drove home from that hospice with my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, and I want to be honest with you about something. I did not drive home loving Grace yet. I drove home understanding, for the first time, exactly how alone that little girl was about to be in this world, and exactly how little it was actually her fault. Vanessa Holt passed away 19 days later. I was not there when it happened, but her hospice social worker called me, because by then I had become, somehow, the person Vanessa trusted most with information about her daughter's future. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my own office and cried for a woman I had met exactly once, and I think that was the moment I understood my life had permanently split into a before and an after, regardless of what I decided to do about my marriage. Her funeral was small, almost unbearably small, held on a Saturday morning at a funeral home outside Madison with maybe 9 people in the chapel, most of them former coworkers from the clinic project who had clearly come out of decency rather than closeness. I brought Grace with me, strapped into her car seat in the back row, because I couldn't bring myself to leave her with a sitter on the day her mother was buried, and because I had a stubborn, unexplainable feeling that someday I would want to be able to tell her, truthfully, that she had been there. Daniel did not come. He told me he had a work deadline, and I remember standing in that thin, fluorescent-lit chapel thinking that I had officially run out of ways to feel surprised by him. A woman I didn't recognize approached me afterward, introduced herself as the friend Vanessa had mentioned, the one who was 7 months pregnant herself and couldn't take on a baby. She held Grace's tiny hand for a long moment, told her she looked just like her mother around the eyes, and then turned to me and said the only thing anyone said to me that whole day that I have never forgotten. She talked about you near the end. She said she hoped whoever opened that door would be someone who actually wanted to be a mother, not just someone who had to become one. I think she got lucky. I did not feel lucky standing in that chapel. I felt like a stranger holding someone else's grief by the hand. But I have come to believe, slowly, over the years since, that she was right about me anyway, even before I believed it myself. What I decided to do about my marriage took considerably longer to sort out, and it got significantly worse before it got better. The first real fracture point came from Daniel's mother, Patricia, who found out about Grace 9 days after the basket appeared on our porch, when Daniel, in a moment of panic about needing childcare help, told her everything. I want you to understand what kind of woman Patricia Carter is before I tell you what she said, because it will explain everything that came after. Patricia had spent decades treating Daniel like the sun that her entire solar system orbited around. Nothing he did was ever fully his fault. Every failure had an external cause, and every success was entirely his own brilliance. When I think back on our marriage now, I can see that pattern everywhere in small things I excused for years because they seemed harmless. The way she'd call her house and ask to speak to her boy before she ever asked how I was doing. The way she'd correct my cooking in front of guests. The way Daniel never once, in 7 years, told her to stop. Patricia showed up at our house on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, and the first thing she said when she saw Grace asleep in the bassinet I'd bought because, frankly, the baby needed somewhere to sleep regardless of how I felt about anything else, was not a question about the baby's well-being. It was this. Well, Megan, I suppose you understand now why he had to look elsewhere. A man has needs, and you weren't exactly giving him a family, were you? I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, the way I had to sit with it standing in my own living room. My husband had impregnated another woman during an affair while I was recovering from a failed embryo transfer, hidden a paternity test from me for 3 months, drained shared funds without my knowledge, and ignored the dying mother of his child until she had no choice but to leave their baby on our porch in a rainstorm. And his mother's read on the situation was that the infertility was the real problem in this story. Get out of my house, Patricia, I said. This is Daniel's house too, she said. It's both our names on the deed, I said, and right now, only one of us is acting like an adult in it. Leave. Daniel, predictably, did not back me up in that moment. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the exact same useless expression he'd worn the night the basket appeared, the expression of a man who badly wants 2 contradictory things to both be true, and he said, Mom, maybe you should go, but you don't have to be so harsh, Megan. As if my response, and not his betrayal, was the thing requiring moderation in this house. That became the rhythm of the next several weeks. Daniel apologizing for the affair in the abstract, while flinching every time I asked him to actually take responsibility for the specifics. He would say he was sorry he hurt me, and then 10 minutes later say something like, but you have to understand, you were so deep in the IVF stuff, I felt invisible, as though his loneliness during my hardest months had somehow purchased him the right to father a child with someone else, and lie about it for a year. I stopped sleeping in our bedroom around the 3rd week. I moved into the guest room with Grace, partly because someone needed to be near her at night, and partly because I genuinely could not stand to lie next to him anymore. It is a strange kind of grief, lying awake next to a person you've shared a bed with for 7 years, and realizing you no longer recognize the shape of him in the dark. Here is the part of the story I think surprised me most, even as I lived it. Somewhere in those sleepless weeks, feeding Grace bottles at 3 a.m. while Daniel slept down the hall, I fell in love with that baby. Not in spite of everything that had happened. almost because of it. She had no idea what kind of mess of adult she'd been born into. She just wanted to be held and fed and sung to in a voice that didn't sound panicked, and somewhere around week 4, I realized I was the only person in this entire situation actually showing up for her every single day. Daniel held her maybe a dozen times in 6 weeks. I held her every single night. My own mother noticed the shift before I admitted it to myself. She drove up from Rochester to see the situation for herself, sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and watched me bounce Grace on my hip while I made dinner with one hand. "You're already her mother," my mom said quietly. "I can see it. The question you actually need to answer isn't whether you love her. It's whether you're going to stay married to the man who made her exist behind your back." I didn't have an answer for her that night. I had one within the month. The thing that finally pushed me past the point of trying to make the marriage work was not a single dramatic event. It was an accumulation of small, cowardly choices Daniel kept making, each one small enough to argue away on its own, all of them adding up to a pattern I could no longer ignore. He missed Grace's first pediatrician appointment because of a work call he could have rescheduled. He referred to her once, in a moment of stress, as Vanessa's baby, instead of his own daughter, in front of me, like he could still hold the situation at arm's length if he just chose the right pronoun. And then, 6 weeks after the basket appeared, I found out he had been actively exploring whether Grace could be placed for adoption without my involvement in the decision. I found out because Patricia let it slip during another one of her unannounced visits, this time delivered with what I can only describe as triumphant relief. "Daniel found a lovely agency," she told me, while I stood frozen at the stove. "A nice young couple in Eden Prairie, can have children of their own. It would solve everything so cleanly. You two could go back to focusing on your own future instead of being saddled with somebody else's mistake." Somebody else's mistake. That was how my mother-in-law described a 6-week-old baby whose mother had died alone in a hospice bed trying to protect her. I confronted Daniel that night, the actual conversation, not the screaming we'd been doing for weeks, but a real conversation, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with Grace asleep upstairs in the crib we'd bought together. Ironically, 2 years earlier, back when we still thought our first IVF round had worked. "Were you really going to place her for adoption without even discussing it with me first?" I asked. He wouldn't quite look at me. "I was exploring options. I didn't make any decisions." "You contacted an agency, Daniel. That's not exploring. That's a decision in progress." "What was I supposed to do, Megan?" His voice cracked, and for a second I almost felt sorry for him, before I remembered exactly why he was cracking. "I don't know how to be her father. I barely know how to look at her without thinking about everything I destroyed to make her exist. You've been doing all of it, the feeding, the appointments, all of it, and I keep telling myself maybe it would be easier on everyone if she just went somewhere she could start clean, without all of this hanging over her." "She's not the one hanging anything over anyone," I said. "You did this. Vanessa is dead because she had nowhere else to turn, and your solution is to erase the one piece of responsibility you actually have left, so you can go back to pretending none of it happened." He didn't have an answer. He never really had an answer for any of it, and that, more than the affair itself, more than the lies, more than his mother's cruelty, is what finally told me everything I needed to know about whether this marriage had a future. I had spent 3 years married to a man I thought was simply quiet and steady. What I learned that autumn was that he wasn't steady. He was just absent in every moment that actually required him to be present, and he had been absent for so long that I had mistaken the silence for calm. Thanksgiving that year fell right in the middle of all of it, and I almost didn't go, but my mother insisted, mostly because she didn't want me sitting alone in a house that no longer felt like mine with a 2-month-old who needed normalcy more than I needed to hide. Daniel showed up too, because by then we were still technically living under the same roof, sleeping in separate rooms, circling each other like two people waiting for the other to make the first real move toward the door. Patricia came as well, uninvited by me, but invited by my mother out of a sense of obligation neither of them would ever fully explain to me, and it turned into the worst holiday dinner of my entire life. She spent the better part of an hour telling my aunt, within earshot of half the table, about how tragic it was that Daniel's indiscretion had to become public knowledge at all, as though the indiscretion itself was the minor offense and my failure to keep it private was the real sin. My mother, to her enormous credit, set down her fork at one point and said, calm as anything, "Patricia, I think you should leave before dessert," and for the first time in my entire life, I watched someone successfully end one of Patricia's monologues with 8 words instead of an argument. Daniel didn't say a thing the entire drive home. Neither did I. We had stopped having anything left to say to each other that wasn't already going to end up in a court filing. I called my best friend Jess the next morning. Jess and I had been roommates in college, and she had gone on to become a family law attorney downtown, the kind of person you call exactly once you've decided you're done asking permission to feel the way you already feel. I need to know everything about custody and adoption rights for a child who isn't biologically mine, I told her, sitting in my car outside her office before I'd even gone inside. And I need to know what protects Grace if her father tries to give her up without my consent. Jess didn't ask a single unnecessary question. That's one of the things I have always loved about her. First thing, she said, we get you legally established as a person with standing in her life, fast, before Daniel does anything else stupid. Step-parent isn't automatic, since you two aren't divorced yet, and there's no formal step-parent process for a baby this new, but we can file for guardianship pending any custody or adoption proceedings, and given the documentation you have, the paternity test, the letter from Vanessa naming her wishes, her death certificate, you have a real shot at being recognized as Grace's de facto caregiver. Second thing, that home equity withdrawal Daniel made, without your knowledge, the $40,000, that matters too, both for the divorce and for establishing a pattern of unilateral decision-making that the court will care about when it comes to who gets a say in Grace's future. And if Daniel actually tries to push the adoption through behind my back, then we go to court immediately and we use every piece of evidence you have, Jess said. Megan, I need you to start documenting everything starting today. Every conversation, every appointment you attend that he skips, every text where his mother says something insane. All of it. I started that afternoon. I bought a small voice recorder, the same kind I'd later learn half the women in similar situations end up buying, because apparently when men and their mothers think no one is keeping score, they say things out loud that they would never put in writing. I recorded 3 separate conversations with Patricia over the following month, each one worse than the last, including one where she suggested I could still leave the baby with the agency and just tell people she didn't survive. A sentence so monstrous I had to play it back twice to believe she'd actually said it. I also started keeping a written log, dates and times of every appointment, every diaper change, every middle-of-the-night feeding, against every instance where Daniel chose work, or his mother, or simply nothing at all, over showing up. Jess had taught me to be almost clinical about it, the way she explained it to me over coffee one Saturday while Grace napped in her stroller beside us. Courts don't care about who hurt you the most, she said. They care about who actually shows up. Feelings are not admissible evidence. A spreadsheet is. So I built a spreadsheet, 1 tab for feedings and appointments, 1 tab for financial transactions, 1 tab for every text message Daniel or Patricia sent that I thought a judge might want to read someday. It felt cold to reduce my life to rows and columns while I was still grieving the marriage I thought I had, but it also gave me something to do with my hands at 2 in the morning besides cry, and that mattered more than I expected it to. I drove out to Madison myself one weekend that November, without telling Daniel, to collect the rest of Grace's belongings from the apartment Vanessa had been renting. Her landlord, a kind older man who had clearly been keeping an eye on things since her death, let me in with a spare key and waited outside in the hallway while I packed up what little there was. A second-hand crib, a diaper bag with exactly 1 extra outfit in it, a shoebox of photographs, most of them of Grace alone, a handful of Vanessa holding her in front of the bathroom mirror, smiling in that particular tired, fierce way new mothers smile when no one else is there to take the picture for them. Tucked beneath the shoebox was a spiral notebook, half filled with what I can only describe as a diary written directly to her daughter, dated entries describing what Grace had eaten that day, what new sound she'd learned to make, and underneath all of it, in increasingly shaky handwriting as the weeks went on, small private confessions about how afraid Vanessa was, how angry she was at Daniel, and how much she hoped that anger would never become Grace's to carry. I sat on the floor of that empty apartment and read the whole notebook before I let myself leave, because I owed her that much, and because some part of me needed to understand the woman whose absence had reshaped my entire life before I could decide how to honor her properly. I still have that notebook. I plan to give it to Grace myself, when she's old enough to read it without it breaking her. By the time Jess filed the guardianship petition in December, I had 11 weeks of documentation showing I was Grace's sole consistent caregiver, alongside the paternity results, Vanessa's handwritten letter naming her wishes, and a paper trail of the $40,000 Daniel had pulled from our shared account without telling me. Daniel found out about the petition the same week his firm found out about everything else because Patricia, in what I can only describe as an act of pure, vindictive panic, decided the way to fight back was to go public. She created a long, weepy Facebook post under her own name, the kind designed to be shared, accusing me of stealing her grandchild, framing herself as a devoted grandmother being cruelly denied access to a baby by a bitter, infertile woman who couldn't stand to see her husband happy with a real family. She posted photos of Daniel holding Grace, photos I hadn't even known existed, taken during one of the handful of times he'd actually picked her up. The post painted a picture of a loving father being persecuted and a heartless wife weaponizing a baby out of jealousy, and within 2 days it had been shared past 1,000 times in our local community groups, the kind of slow-motion small city scandal that follows you into the grocery store. I sat with that post open on my laptop for a long time before I responded, because I understood the way Vanessa's lawyer-shaped social worker had once warned me indirectly through Jess, that once you respond publicly, there's no quiet way back from it. I responded anyway. I wrote my own post, factual, calm, and devastating, because the truth, laid out plainly, did not need embellishment. I described the affair during my second IVF failure. I described the paternity test hidden for 3 months. I described the $40,000 taken from shared funds without my knowledge. I described Vanessa's 3 unanswered days of calls before she made the drive in the rain, and her death 19 days after leaving her daughter on our porch. I attached a photo of the letter, with Vanessa's name visible, but the rest of her words respectfully summarized rather than fully exposed, because whatever else was true, she deserved better than to be turned into spectacle by people who never had the decency to answer her calls while she was alive. I ended the post with 1 paragraph about who had actually shown up for Grace every single day since October, and I let the math speak for itself. The post took 4 hours to outpace Patricia's original one in shares. Comments shifted within the day, the way they always do once people get the fuller picture. Neighbors who had nodded politely at me in the produce aisle that week started leaving messages instead. Women I barely knew telling me they admired how I'd handled it. A few former co-workers of Vanessa's from the Madison Project reaching out privately to confirm details I hadn't even included, because apparently several people at that firm had quietly known about the affair the entire time and said nothing. Daniel's firm found out by the following Monday. Architecture firms care, it turns out, about reputational fallout just as much as any other company, and a partner asked to speak with him privately about whether personal matters were going to continue affecting client perception, since 2 of their corporate clients had specifically mentioned the viral posts. He wasn't fired, not immediately, but he was quietly moved off 2 major accounts and told, in the careful language companies use when they mean exactly what they're not saying, that his trajectory at the firm needed to be reassessed. My own workplace had its version of that conversation too, though it played out very differently. My manager, a woman named Renata who had always struck me as fair but no-nonsense, called me into a conference room 2 days after my post went viral, and for 1 second I assumed I was about to be handed the same kind of quiet ultimatum Daniel had received from his own firm. Instead, she closed the door, sat down across from me, and said, "I just want you to know HR flagged the situation because corporate communications got a couple of calls about employees being named in a viral post, but I told them you didn't name your company anywhere, you didn't post from a work account, and frankly, half this office has been rooting for you since the day you walked in carrying a diaper bag and didn't drop a single deadline. You're not in trouble. I just wanted to check on you as a person, not as a liability." I sat in that conference room and cried for the second time that week, except this time it wasn't grief. It was the strange, disorienting relief of someone finally treating my situation as something that had happened to me rather than something I needed to apologize for. Not every institution in this story failed me. I think it's important to say that out loud because it would have been easy to walk away from that entire winter believing every system was rigged against the person trying to do the right thing. Mine wasn't. Renata wasn't. Jess wasn't. The pediatrician who answered my frantic midnight call about formula brands wasn't either. There were enough decent people scattered through the wreckage to remind me what decency actually looked like right when I needed reminding most. Patricia, for her part, did not take the public reversal well. She showed up at my office one afternoon in January, the same kind of unannounced ambush her son favored, except louder, demanding at the front desk to see me, telling the receptionist I had stolen her grandchild, loudly enough that 2 co-workers came out of a meeting room to see what was happening. I came out into the lobby calmly, because by then I had learned that calm was the only weapon that actually worked against her. "You need to leave the building, Patricia," I said. "Not until you tell everyone in this office what kind of woman you really are," she said, voice rising, an audience of confused co-workers gathering near the elevators. "Taking a man's child away from his own family because you couldn't give him one of your own." "I didn't take anything," I said. "I'm the one who's been raising her every single day since her mother died alone in a hospice bed because nobody in your family would answer her calls. If you want to talk about what kind of woman someone is, we can absolutely have that conversation, but I'd suggest we have it with the police, since you're currently trespassing in my workplace and harassing me in front of witnesses." Her face went through several colors in quick succession, and for one wild second I thought she might actually attempt to physically grab me, the way her energy had escalated past anything resembling reason. Building security arrived before it got that far, called by my own manager, and escorted her out while she shouted something about lawyers over her shoulder that, as it turned out, she never followed through on because her own attorney, when she finally consulted one, apparently told her plainly that she had no legal standing whatsoever and a documented pattern of harassment that could work against Daniel's case, not mine. I want to tell you that was the lowest point, but it wasn't quite. The lowest point came 2 weeks later, in family court, during the actual guardianship and custody hearing, when Daniel, sitting at the opposing table with his own attorney, finally said out loud, under oath, the thing I think he had believed all along but never had the nerve to say to my face. "I never asked for any of this," he told the judge, when asked about his level of involvement in Grace's care since October. "I think honestly Megan wanted a baby so badly that she latched onto this one because it was convenient. I don't think this is really about what's best for Grace. I think it's about what Megan needed to feel okay about everything she went through with the infertility stuff." I sat very still in that courtroom and let him finish saying it, because Jess had told me beforehand, calmly, almost gently, "Let him talk. Every word he says like that is doing our work for us." His own attorney tried to walk it back almost immediately, asking him a follow-up question clearly designed to soften the blow. "Mr. Carter, to be clear, are you saying you don't believe the child should remain with Miss Carter?" Daniel hesitated, glanced toward his mother sitting in the gallery behind him, and said, "I'm saying I don't think any of this is really about Grace. I think it's about Megan." Jess stood up at that point, and I watched her cross-examine him with the same unhurried patience she'd used on me over coffee months earlier. "Mr. Carter," she said, "who took Grace to her 2-month checkup? Megan did. Who took her to her 4-month checkup? Megan. Who has fed her, by your own count, 6 times in 11 weeks? I did 6 times. Yes. And who, by the same count, fed her the other 137? He didn't answer that one at all. He just looked down at the table in front of him, and the silence in that courtroom lasted long enough that I could hear the court reporter's machine clicking through it, recording nothing because there was nothing left for him to say. She was right. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Aaliyah Patton, who had clearly heard every flavor of self-justification a parent could offer, looked at Daniel for a long moment after he finished, and then asked him a single question that, more than anything Jess or I had presented, decided the outcome of that hearing. "Mr. Carter, In the 11 weeks since this child came into your household, how many times have you personally administered a feeding, a diaper change, or attended a medical appointment without your wife present? Daniel hesitated long enough that the silence itself answered the question before he did. I don't have an exact number, he finally said. I do, Judge Patton said, and gestured toward the log Jess had submitted into evidence weeks earlier, 11 single-spaced pages documenting 143 instances of care, every single one performed by me. Ms. Carter's count is 143. Yours, by your own attorney's submission, is 6. I think the record speaks clearly to what's actually been happening in that household, regardless of how either of you feels about how it started. The court granted me temporary primary guardianship of Grace that day, pending a final custody determination that, 3 months later, made it permanent, with Daniel retaining limited supervised visitation that, I want to be honest with you, he exercised exactly 4 times before quietly letting it lapse altogether. I think some part of him had wanted an exit from fatherhood from the very beginning, and the court process simply gave him a paper trail to walk through that door, without having to call it what it was. The divorce itself moved faster than I expected, mostly because Daniel, drained by the fallout at work and the public humiliation his mother had triggered, seemed to want it over almost as badly as I did, just for entirely different reasons. The house, which had been purchased jointly, but with a down payment that came substantially from an inheritance my grandmother had left me before our wedding, was awarded to me, the same way the $40,000 taken from our home equity line was factored into the settlement against him. I want to tell you, I felt triumphant when the papers were finalized. Mostly I just felt tired, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent 6 months being strong in a courtroom and 3 a.m. feedings and viral Facebook comment sections, and who finally gets to just sit down. The adoption itself, the part where Grace legally became my daughter and not simply a child in my guardianship, took another full year to finalize, since Daniel initially refused to terminate his parental rights out of what I genuinely believe was pure spite rather than any real desire to parent her. He changed his mind eventually, after his attorney apparently explained to him exactly how unflattering it would look and how financially burdensome it would remain, to retain rights to a child he had visited 4 times in over a year. He signed the relinquishment papers on a gray Tuesday in March, in a lawyer's conference room I wasn't even present for, and Jess called me the second it was done. It's official, she said. She's yours. Completely, legally, permanently yours. I cried in my kitchen for almost 20 minutes, Grace asleep on my shoulder the entire time, because by then she was old enough to walk and talk and demand to be held only when she felt like it, and on that particular afternoon, by some small mercy, she felt like it. I remember standing at that same kitchen island where I had first read Vanessa's letter, almost exactly a year and a half earlier, and thinking about how strange it was that the worst night of my life and one of the best afternoons of my life had happened in the exact same square footage of tile. I had spent so many months associating that kitchen with the sound of an envelope tearing open that I had nearly forgotten it was also the room where I fed Grace her very first bottle, where I taught her to say more before she could say almost anything else, where, on that gray Tuesday afternoon, I finally got to stop bracing for a phone call that might take her away from me. Some rooms hold more than one kind of memory. I think that's true of marriages too, and of mothers, and of doorsteps in the rain. I want to take a moment here to tell you what happened to Patricia, because I think it matters for anyone wondering whether people like her ever face consequences. She did not stop trying to insert herself after the adoption was finalized. She showed up at Grace's daycare twice without authorization, claiming to be picking her up as the grandmother, until the staff, who I had warned in advance and provided documentation to, turned her away both times and eventually banned her from the premises entirely after the second attempt, which involved her raising her voice at a daycare worker in front of a room full of toddlers. I filed for, and was granted, a formal no-contact order on Grace's behalf 6 months after the adoption finalized, following an incident where Patricia followed us in her car from a grocery store parking lot to within 2 blocks of our house, an act that, once reported and documented with a dash cam I had started keeping in my own car specifically because of her, was enough for a judge to take seriously. I have not seen her since, and Grace, mercifully, is far too young to remember any of it. Daniel, for his part, sent me one final text message about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. By then, he had also, quietly and without any announcement, paid back the remaining balance on the home equity line, the $40,000 plus the interest that had accrued on it while we fought over who actually owed what to whom. I found out about the repayment the same week his text arrived, a coincidence I don't think was actually a coincidence at all, like some small, wordless part of him needed to settle the ledger before he allowed himself to say the rest out loud. I want to share his message with you exactly as he wrote it because I think it tells you everything about who he ultimately decided to be in this story. I know I don't deserve to say this, but I'm sorry. For all of it. For Vanessa, for lying, for what I said in court for my mom. I hope Grace has a good life. I hope you do too. I read it twice, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and then I did something I genuinely didn't expect myself to do. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't respond with forgiveness either, because I don't think I owed him that, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully feel it. I just typed back 4 words. I hope so too. And then I blocked the number, not out of cruelty, but because I had finally, fully understood that closure isn't something someone else hands you in a text message. It's something you build for yourself, brick by brick, in all the ordinary days that come after the dramatic ones end. I want to tell you what those ordinary days actually looked like because I think that's the part people forget to ask about once the courtroom drama wraps up. I kept the house near Lake Harriet. I got promoted at work. Partly, my manager told me later with a laugh, because the entire office had watched me handle a public scandal with more composure than most people handle a printer jam. Grace turned 2 that spring, a loud, curious, stubborn little girl with Vanessa's dark eyes and absolutely none of Daniel's caution, and somewhere in the chaos of toddlerhood, I stopped thinking of her as the baby from the doorstep and started simply thinking of her as my daughter, full stop, no qualifier needed. I met Theo about 1.5 years after the divorce, out of all places, Grace's pediatrician's office, where he was waiting with his own son from a previous marriage for a routine checkup. He was a high school biology teacher, divorced amicably from a marriage that had simply run its course rather than detonated the way mine had, and the first thing I noticed about him, sitting 2 chairs down in that waiting room, was how unhurried he was with his son. How he answered every single one of the kids' rambling questions about why ceiling tiles have holes in them with the same patient attention he probably gave his actual students. We talked for 20 minutes waiting for our names to be called. We exchanged numbers in the parking lot afterward, both of us a little embarrassed about how easily it had happened. I was careful with him, slower than I think he wanted me to be at first, because trust, once it's been broken the way mine was, doesn't rebuild itself on the same timeline as anything else. But Theo never once made me feel rushed about it. He met Grace for the first time at a park, 6 weeks into us seeing each other, and spent the entire visit letting her boss him around a swing set, and on the drive home, when I asked him what he thought, all he said was, "She's got opinions." I respect that in a person. I think that was the moment I started letting myself believe this could actually be something real. We got married 2 years later, in a small backyard ceremony with maybe 30 guests, nothing like the wedding Daniel and I had thrown years earlier with 300 people and a band, and a marriage that turned out to be hollow underneath all the decoration. Grace, by then 4 years old, was our flower girl, and she took the job with the kind of fierce seriousness only a 4-year-old can bring to scattering rose petals slightly too aggressively across a backyard lawn. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. Jess gave a toast that somehow made fun of every legal document she'd ever filed on my behalf, while still managing to make half the yard tear up. Theo's son, Sam, who was 8 at the time, asked Grace partway through the reception if she wanted to be his real sister now, or just a kind of stepsister. And Grace, with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old who has never once doubted her place in a room, told him, "I'm just your sister. There's no kind," and that, more than any vow Theo and I exchanged that afternoon, is the sentence I think about when people ask me what it feels like to have rebuilt a family out of the wreckage of one that fell apart. There was no asterisk on it for her. There never needed to be. We didn't take a honeymoon right away, partly because 2 kids and 2 careers don't leave a lot of room for spontaneous travel, but the following summer, Theo and I drove the 4 of us up to a cabin on a lake in northern Minnesota for a week, and one evening, sitting on the dock while the kids chased fireflies in the dark behind us, Theo asked me, out of nowhere. Whether I still thought about that first night, the basket, the letter, all of it. I told him the truth, which is that I think about it constantly, but not the way I used to. For a long time after the divorce, I thought about that night the way you think about a car accident, replaying the impact over and over, looking for the exact second everything could have gone differently. Now I think about it the way you think about a door. It was just a door that opened on a rainy Tuesday, and on the other side of it was the rest of my life, the one I actually ended up wanting, even though nothing about how I got there looked anything like the plan. Sometimes, late at night, after Grace and Sam are both asleep down the hall, I think about Vanessa and I hope, wherever she is, she knows how things turned out. I think about the 19 days she had left after she made that drive in the rain, and I wonder if some part of her already knew, even then, that leaving her daughter on a stranger's porch was actually the bravest, most loving thing she could have done, not the desperate act it must have felt like in the moment. I think about the letter she wrote, the one that started my entire unraveling, and I remember the line that has stayed with me longer than any of the cruelty Daniel or Patricia ever threw at me. I am asking you for everything after giving you nothing but a problem. She didn't give me a problem. I understand that now. In a way I couldn't possibly have understood it standing at my kitchen island that first rainy night, soaked envelope shaking in my hands. She gave me my daughter. Everything else, the affair, the lies, the courtroom, the viral posts, all of it was just the noise a broken marriage makes on its way out the door. The baby in the basket was never the wreckage. She was the one good, true thing that came out of all of it, and somewhere along the way, without ever planning to, I became exactly the kind of mother Vanessa was hoping anyone, would be willing to become for her. People ask me sometimes, usually carefully, usually after a glass of wine has loosened their nerve enough to actually say it out loud, whether I ever resent Grace, even a little, for the way she came into my life. I understand why they ask. I spent 3 years grieving a baby I couldn't have, only to end up raising one that arrived through the worst betrayal of my marriage instead. It would make a strange kind of sense if some part of me flinched every time I looked at her. It never has. Not once. I think love doesn't actually care very much about the circumstances of its own arrival. It just shows up, the way she did, soaked and crying on a doorstep in October, and asks you to decide, right then, whether you're going to be the kind of person who opens the door wider or the kind who closes it. I chose to open it. I would choose it again. Every single time, no matter how many rainy nights it took to get here. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with our story. Grace is 6 now. She still doesn't fully understand the shape of how our family came to be, and someday, when she's old enough, I'll tell her the truth, gently, in pieces, the way you tell a child anything that complicated. I'll tell her that her birth mother loved her enough to make an impossible choice in the rain, and that love, real love, sometimes shows up looking nothing like what you expected it to look like when it finally arrives at your door.